Hello and welcome to the Violin Chronicles, a show about the lives of great violin makers throughout history. My name is Linda Lespe and I am a violin maker in Sydney, Australia, with my husband Antoine. In this episode, I would like to invite you to discover this wonderful maker who has for so long slipped under the radar. This guy, I would have to say, is a favourite of many experts who get a kind of look about them when they start talking about Pietro of Mantua. I love this story about Pietro Guarneri. It has mad dukes, angry fathers, long-suffering wives, invasions, sieges, art theft, and oh so many children. A touch of court intrigue and a dash of treason. It was indeed a surprise, I can tell you. When I first started looking at this maker, never would I have imagined such a colourful existence. So stay with me as I take a deep dive into Pietro Guarneri's Mantua. One afternoon, my husband and I were working in our shop here in Sydney. It's more of a studio than an actual store. One large room absolutely filled with violins, violas and cellos. They hang off racks covering all the walls. We have a large piece of furniture with pigeonholes for violins that are in pieces awaiting restoration. Cellos are lined up in the corner next to our stack of wood, waiting to be transformed into an instrument. It smells like cedar, spruce, linseed oil and varnish. It's a little corner of the city many musicians in Sydney's various orchestras will come to when their instrument has a problem, needs a checkup, or even buy something new or old. My husband Antoine and I are violin makers. We met in France at the École Nationale de Lutherie, the French National Violin Making School. But for the last 15 years we have been here in Sydney, not too far from some of Australia's main orchestras and their instruments. We have been incredibly fortunate to have had many fine violins pass through this workshop over the years, but the thrill and pure delight of seeing a master's work never fades. And so, late last year, in November 2024, my heart sped up just a little bit when the new concertmeister of one of Sydney's orchestras, having recently arrived in Australia to take up his job, clicked open his violin case in the workshop and pulled out his 17th century Italian Pietro Guarneri of Mantua violin. This exquisite instrument had been decorated with the unmistakable fleur-de-lis pattern inserted into the four corners of the violin, a very French symbol if ever there was one. Interestingly, its player today is also a Frenchman, but why does this Italian instrument have the French royal symbol on it? Let me tell you a story about a flaky duke, his fearless duchess, who was no more than a teenager at the time, her violin maker, and the French connection that ended up on his violins. You might be saying to yourself, Guarneri, I know that name. Well, yes, the most famous of the family is a man named Guarneri del Gesù. Some of his beautiful instruments are also played in orchestras in Australia as well, but this is the story of his uncle, Pietro. The year is 1655 and we are in the industrious city of Cremona in Lombardy, in what is modern-day northern Italy. This area has for years now been known for its fine instrument makers, in particular the Amati family, who live just around the corner from the house we find ourselves in now. It is a freezing February morning when the couple, Anna Maria and Andrea Guarneri, welcomed their son Pietro into the world. The previous year, they had had a baby girl, Angela Teresa, who did not live long enough to even have her first birthday. But now they have a son. Here I speak to Philip Cass, violin expert and co-author of a brand new book that has just come out on the violin makers of Mantua called Luteria Mantovana. Here we are discussing Pietro's early life in Cremona.
The Guarneri family, starting with Andrea, had become involved in the musical instrument making trade, apprenticeship, and assistance to Niccolo Amati, who was the preeminent maker in the world at the time. Niccolo was unmarried and had no children, and I think that Andrea had every reason to expect that he might take over the business one day. And then lo and behold, Niccolo got married and had a son. And that sort of put paid to that whole concept. Anyway, it was not terribly long after that that Andrea decided to leave and start his own business, conveniently located right around the corner, and had his own son, who very early on showed great talent as a violin maker.
A year after Pietro is born, he has a sister, another Angela Teresa. 2 years after that, a brother, Eusebio, and then 2 more sisters, Elisabetta and Anna. And finally, when Pietro is 11, little Giuseppe Giovanni is born, the baby of the family. And doesn't he know it? Now, as many an eldest child, Pietro was an overachiever. At an early age, he would have started playing an instrument. I mean, he was surrounded by the things. And not only that, but various family members were accomplished musicians who could have helped, and Pietro was someone his little brother looked up to. Idolized even. At about the age of 14, he would have started helping his father in the workshop on the ground floor of their home, and here too he excelled. His fine craftsmanship would have pulled up the standard of the workshop for the benefit of the family business. And as he grew, Pietro would help his father more and more in the construction of instruments, and perhaps now Andrea was beginning to imagine the Guarneri workshop becoming the next big thing after the Amatis. With the extra manpower of his sons and the talent of Pietro, they could really go places. And this is a classic case of the student surpassing the master. Pietro executed beautiful work and was a skilled craftsman. Philip Cass.
By the 1670s, a great deal of what was coming from Andrea Guarneri's workshop was partly or substantially the work of Pietro. And I think that his father had every reason to believe that his son would become one of the great makers and would raise the family stock up to the status of the Amatis. And indeed, that might have happened, except that Andrea Guarneri had married a woman who was from a very prominent family of musicians and with very good connections in the music world. And for better or for worse, Pietro showed great talent as a musician as well as a violin maker. And I think that at some stage, because the family finances were not ticking along quite so nicely, there were some financial issues that Andrea had that were complicated and suggested that finances were not all that strong. Pietro decided that he would try his luck elsewhere.
In 1676, Pietro makes a viola in his father's workshop that today is called the Conte Vitali. He is about 19 years old at the time, and as he stopped and had a look around his native city, he would have remarked on the increasing number of violin makers, most of whom had learned from the same master as his father, Niccolo Amati. But how many violin makers did one average-sized city need? Now, something you must know about Cremona is that it was an incredibly strategically placed city, and during wars, any war really, it was a thoroughfare for passing armies. To cross the mighty Po River that divided what is now Italy, Cremona was the place to do it, if you wanted access to the south of the country or moving northwards, and at this time it was controlled by the Spanish crown. The economy was lagging, and what with all the competition, the future did not look all that bright. At the moment, there were no passing armies to stress the city's resources, but I wouldn't hold your breath. This is Cremona after all. It would only be a matter of time before something blew. Unbeknown to Pietro and his fellow citizens, this Guarneri's future employer was getting on with the job and making a series of catastrophic, brash, and really not very well thought out decisions, whilst maxing out his cards on hair products, jewels, clothes, horses, and the ladies. I give you the Duke of Mantua. But more about him later. In 1677, Pietro is 22 years old. His little bro, Eusebio, is 19 and enters the priesthood. Well, we'll see how that goes. But for now, Pietro has other things on his mind. He has just asked the lovely Caterina Sassagni to marry him. She is about the same age as his little brother, Eusebio, 19, and she has agreed. After Pietro and Caterina's wedding, the happy couple came back to live in the family home. Eusebio, Pietro's little brother, had decided he was out of there. His house was getting smaller by the day. Pietro had brought home Caterina to live with them, so presumably they get their own room, making the living space that much smaller. There is his older sister, Angela, and then the two younger girls, Elisabetta is 17 and Anna is 14, and then there's the baby, Giuseppe, who is 11, all living in the one small house. Caterina, Pietro's wife, falls pregnant almost immediately after they are married, and Pietro and her have a little son, Andrea Francesco. Sadly, this little baby only lives 3 days. This was a trying time for Pietro, and as he headed out for another music gig, he couldn't help hearing once again about the city of Mantua with its flamboyant court full of artists and musicians who were really quite well paid. An idea started to form in his mind. If he were to be employed at the court of Mantua, he would have a house of his own. His father wouldn't dictate what he could and couldn't do. He knew he was a good violin maker. Why, just a few years ago he had made almost entirely that viola for the noble family, and they were happy with it. Only now, if he was his own man in Mantua, he would be able to put his own label in his instruments, not his father's, and what's more, there were absolutely no violin makers in Mantua to speak of. It could be just the thing to start anew with Caterina, especially after the loss of the baby. Well, 2 years after Pietro and Caterina were married, they had decided to make the move to Mantua. When Pietro left the family home in Cremona, he took his wife, her dowry, and a few household items. He had some connections in Mantua, thanks to his music making, but he was confident that he would be able to find a place as a musician at the court of Mantua. If things didn't work out, they were not too far away. It was a day's journey. They could always return to Cremona, but for now Pietro was happy to leave this city that already had so many violin makers in it. It didn't know what to do with them. He wasn't leaving his father completely desperate in any case. There was always little Giuseppe, who was now starting to work in the workshop, who could help Andrea as the extra set of hands. Besides, Pietro preferred playing music, and court life in Mantua was far more interesting for a musician than Cremona. Mantua was ruled by dukes who were willing to pay handsomely for composition and the musicians who would play their music. Pietro's grandfather on his mother's side, the Orcellis, had been the organist at San Marco in Venice, and his uncle had also been a fine violinist and viol player. He too could show his skills and live as a musician. In August of 1679, Caterina, Pietro's wife, petitioned Andrea Guarneri, her father-in-law, for the return of her dowry, and as you could imagine, this went down like a lead balloon. They were heading into autumn, and things were not looking great on the financial front. Well, Andrea is a violin maker. Is this surprising, really? And now he is losing his best and/or only worker, and Caterina's dowry, and skipping off to Mantua. Well, really. Andrea was not happy. Pietro's sister Angela was about to get married, and they had to come up with her dowry. Pietro was throwing a spanner in the works by leaving and taking Caterina's dowry with him. They simply did not have the money for Angela. Yeah, so I really did get the impression that his father was not happy about. I felt like he felt kind of abandoned because and a little bit passive aggressive. Like there's just these things saying, well, I'm giving twice as much to Giuseppe because he's the son that stood by me.
Right. Right.
And there was another one where he was saying, I'm just basically giving the bare minimum to Pietro.
Yeah.
So, Philip Cass.
That I've now gone through all three of Andrea Guarneri's testamenti. It's very clear that Pietro was only going to get the bare minimum of anything, and his father begrudges him everything. but then goes out of his way, especially in the Second Testamento, to cite how Giuseppe has been his supporter and his assistant and has put in all his time and effort in the making of violins. The implication being not like that ne'er-do-well brother of his who went to Mantua and made a big career as a musician. But I think that Andrea really probably thought, Pietro, this is one of the most talented violin makers in our history, as talented as Niccolo Amati. Potentially, we could become the Amatis of the next generation. And then he turns around and says, oh, I'm going to go and take this job in Mantua. I think it's much better opportunity for me.
Today, the distance between Cremona and Mantua is about 70 kilometres or 45 miles, and you can do that trip in an hour in your speedy little Italian car. But in Pietro's day, it was like moving to another country. Remember that Cremona was under Spanish rule. Mantua was technically an independent dukedom at the moment, in cahoots with France. And so to understand what kind of court Pietro was going to work at, we have to understand what was going on with the Dukes of Mantua at the time. Now brace yourselves, this story is full of complicated alliances and unstable relationships. A bit like Days of Our Lives meets Star Wars, but here we go. Zoom in to the Mantuan court. Anna Isabella Gonzaga sat tapping her fingers rhythmically on the dresser, inwardly seething. Years of being taught to control her emotions and to comport herself like a lady were the only things holding her temper back. How dare he? Guastalla was hers and everyone knew it. In 1679, a year before Pietro moves to Mantua, Anna Isabella Gonzaga was the Duchess of Mantua and had been since she was 16 years old. She's 24 now. And in the tradition of the great dukes and duchesses of this city, her court was full of talented artists, musicians, composers, even craftsmen. She was even thinking of employing a lutai to make instruments for the court from Cremona. The city renowned for producing the greatest instrument makers, no less. She was an intelligent and powerful woman, some might say controlling and strategic, but that's the job description in Renaissance Mantua, isn't it? So no, she was not going to let her cousin swan in and take Guastalla, her hometown, from her. Anna Isabella Gonzaga was the heir to her father's dukedom, the small yet prosperous city of Guastalla, 30 kilometres or 19 miles south of Mantua. Her husband was actually the Duke of Mantua, and she had married him. And like Mantua, Guastalla boasted a court brimming with artists, musicians, poets, composers, architects, and fine craftsmen. A court to rival any in the Renaissance era. But when her father died, when Anna Isabella was just 18 and having no sons, his title was left to his eldest daughter, the current Duchess of Mantua, her. When Anna had married the 19-year-old Duke of Mantua, Ferdinando Carlo, she herself was only 16. Their aunt, none other than the Empress Dowager Eleonora Gonzaga, had arranged the marriage to bring together the two branches of the Gonzaga family in the hope that they would stop fighting and get on with things. Anna Isabella came from the Guastalla Gonzagas, and Ferdinand came from the French branch, and yes, they were cousins, let's keep it in the family, and no, they would never have children. I wonder why. A problem for another day, because right now, the Mantuan Duke and Duchess were in the process of losing the tidy little dukedom of Guastalla to Anna Isabella's cousin, Vincenzo, the closest male heir. He probably thought they were pushovers being such a young power couple, and now a year after her father's death he had made his move, marrying her younger sister, and also his cousin, Anna Maria. How dare he? And now he has proclaimed himself the Duke of Guastalla. Mantua would not take this sitting down, even now. Ferdinand's advisors were with him. He would contest Don Vincenzo and take back Guastalla. Now, all this is happening at the same time that Pietro and Caterina are moving to Mantua. The year is 1679, and as Anna Isabella is brooding on the loss of her hometown, Pietro Guarneri has packed up his belongings in Cremona and moved to Mantua to make a life for himself. The first thing Pietro would have done once he arrived in Mantua was to present himself at the Gonzaga court, and although the young Duke Ferdinand was a great lover of the arts and surrounded himself with the finest of everything, reliability was not his middle name, and as time went on, the court realized that it was his young wife, Anna Isabella, his duchess, who you needed to address to find a place, for example, as a court musician. In any case, Ferdinand was busy. He had parties to attend, women to woo, and lots of hair to curl. He was throwing money he didn't have at the arts and charitable associations. It wasn't easy running a dukedom, and well, he had to wear fabulous clothes and look good, or no one would take him seriously. Now, the reality was that this seemingly wealthy court with its fine artists and trend-setting nobles was, in fact, a sinking ship. There were cracks in the hull that no one could see just yet, but things were definitely on a slippery slope. And the only thing to say in Ferdinand's defense would be that he had inherited this vessel at the already sinking stage. If Mantua was the Titanic, the lifeboats would have been deployed by now. In short, the Duke Ferdinand had no money, but what he did have was a plan. Okay, things were not looking good with Guastalla, the town his wife came from, and just between you and me, this was probably his fault, but we can get into that later. He had sent his minister, Ercole Mattioli, to France for advice, and a solution was found. In a secret treaty, Mantua granted Louis XIV the right to station men in the fortress of Casale, known as the Key to Italy. And for this tidy manoeuvre, he would be given 100,000 scudi for services never performed as head of the French armies in Italy. At the same time, this Mantuan minister, Ercole Mattioli, was persuaded for an interesting amount of money to kiss and tell about his deal to the Savoyards. This created no end of problems for the French, who then arrested the Mantuan minister and locked him up. Many believe this double agent was, in fact, the famous Man in the Iron Mask. Now we return to our young couple, Pietro and his wife, who have just moved to Mantua. Caterina has just had their second child, a little girl, Anna Maria. Named after Pietro's mother, they have found a place to stay thanks to some contacts of Pietro's from the music world, and now he is concentrating on setting up a small workshop where he can service instruments of the many musicians residing at the court of Mantua. There are no lute, or violin makers, in the city, so this shouldn't be too hard to spread the word that he's now in town. And secondly, he is going to look for work as a musician, because this is where things were getting interesting for violin and viol players such as himself. The Gonzaga court had composers, artists, artisans and musicians under their patronage, and if Pietro could only get himself appointed as a court musician, he and his family would be guaranteed an income, a little bit like a civil servant. Philip Cass talks about the lengths the Gonzagas went to keep their artists in-house.
The Gonzagas had great difficulty keeping employees. They'd come to Mantua, and they'd discover it was cold and wet all winter long, and that then it was blazing hot and full of malaria in the summer, and they'd want to find some much nicer and more temperate environment to be in. And there's cases of several of the people who were in their employ, artists and sculptors, who would simply go on a holiday somewhere else and then just send back notes, "Oh, I'm not returning." So what happened after a while was that the Gonzagas, if you got their employment, you had to turn in your passport and you could not leave the city. And when they really decided they trusted you, they would grant you a passport. But up until that date, he could not leave town.
Oh, or he'd lose his job.
He'd lose his job and probably lose his property too.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was
Yeah.
so constraining because I was thinking, oh, it's not that far from Cremona. He could go
No,
back and visit, but you can't.
it's
Oh,
it's
wow.
it's very close, but there's a very definite border between the two,
Yeah.
and especially getting out of Mantua, because in those days the swampland was uncrossable, and the area, the Palazzo Te, this beautiful palace with gardens, was originally on an island, and the waters around it were really just kept everything in. So you needed to go through a border crossing just to get out of town.
Yeah, so they could control things
Yeah,
quite thoroughly.
right.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so they've trapped you in the swamp, in this island in a
Yeah.
swamp, basically.
I mean,
But that was very musical.
yeah, they had this system rigged up whereby, in the event of a major invasion, if they needed to, they could break some dikes upriver that would flood the Mincio River and flood the swampland to the depth of about 10 feet. So it was, and they were wide, so it's like a half a mile to a mile of swampland that would then be 10 feet deep. It would be a lake,
Oh, wow.
and you could not get an army across that. So they were protected. The only thing they had to worry about was getting in food and not getting sick from cholera, which they managed to do often enough as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I suppose they had like bacterial warfare as well. Like they
Yeah,
were like, you can't get in. We'll kill you
right.
with malaria before you do.
Yeah.
In 1682, after 2 years of working in this new city, Pietro was doing quite well for himself. He and Caterina were living comfortably in their new home with the baby. Caterina was pregnant once again, and Pietro had made good contacts with the Gonzaga court. He had a knack at managing his money. Goodness knows where this instinct came from. He seems to be the only one in the family to do so. At the moment, he couldn't even return to Cremona, even if he wanted to. It was important to be present at court for employment opportunities. Although the Guarneris were settling in nicely in Mantua, sadly their second daughter, the little Anna Maria, died just before her second birthday. It was always heartbreaking to lose a child, and hopefully it wouldn't affect Caterina too greatly, as she was already 5 months pregnant with another baby. Shortly after Anna Maria died, she gave birth to their third daughter, whom they also named Anna Maria. In 1685, 3 years on, and Pietro is finally appointed court musician under the Gonzaga patronage. Officially, it was the Duke Ferdinando Carlo who had appointed him, but it was common knowledge that his real boss was the Duchess, Anna Isabella. Not only was he recognized as a musician at court, but also as an instrument maker. And now, with his official position cemented into place as a first job, he also was commissioned to make a set of instruments for the Duchess Anna Isabella. For the Duke of Mantua. I spoke to Philip Cass about a set of instruments Pietro made for the Gonzaga court, decorated with the fleur-de-lis motif.
One of the little quirks about Mantua was that in the early 1600s, I think it was 1628, the last of the Italian Gonzagas died with no heir. And that last Gonzaga set up as his heir a child from the French branch of the Gonzaga family. So automatically then Mantua became a territory of the Gonzagas, but ultimately answerable to the French court, because everything ended up being answerable to the French court, which didn't please anybody else around them either. So this became a very unstable situation. It was this town that was essentially an island, which had cold, humid weather all winter for pneumonia, and hot, humid weather all summer for malaria, because it was also very swampy. Now, the last of the French Gonzagas was the one who was ruling at the time that Pietro went there. And because the French Gonzagas were part of France, they incorporated the fleur-de-lis into their own crest, and that's why the fleur-de-lis are on the corners of those instruments. From 84 until probably around 88 or 89, that he appears to have made an ensemble for the court. Now, this is off books. This is not carried in the account books of orders for the Gonzaga court, but it's a commonality between all those instruments that suggests that it was deliberate for their purposes. Meanwhile, in 1685, he did receive a court appointment as a musician, but which also acknowledged that he was a violin maker.
Right. And would he have been allowed to use the fleur-de-lis if on an instrument that wasn't for the court, or was that a symbol that was reserved for the nobility?
Well, the fleur-de-lis was a symbol for the court, and therefore the instruments he made for them would have had the fleur-de-lis. But he didn't use that on any of his other instruments.
Okay. In Mantua, high above the Piazza Sordello, swings an iron cage. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, it was usually occupied by a dead or dying man. The lords of Mantua had their quota of fratricide or treasonable sons and murderous uncles, of wives caught in adultery and killed for their crimes. Its citizens, as well as its princes, had their times of horror, their years of tribulation. Like all city-states, it was born in feudal anarchy and nurtured by interurban strife. These are the words of the eminent English historian J.H. Plum. Today, the city of Mantua stands on the banks of two large lakes. But in Pietro's day, it was an island surrounded by lakes formed by the Mincio River. You could access Mantua by crossing one of its bridges, or sailing in on a boat from the lower lake into Porto Catena. From here you could navigate with a smaller vessel into the heart of Mantua by making your way up the Rio, or small river, that traversed the city and up which fish and other products were brought into the town and sold at the market. Pietro Guarneri would have most likely entered by the large bridge of San Giorgio into the city, then winding his way through the streets with his wife and their belongings to find their lodgings. Pietro left his house and headed up the street towards the ducal palace. As he passed through the Piazza delle Erbe, he ducked under the porticos that lined the perimeter of the piazza, offering shelter from the bad weather. Bad weather that hadn't appeared to have scared off the market vendors selling their wares, yelling out their produce for all who cared to hear. He continued under the rows of arcades for a surprisingly short walk, almost in a straight line from his street towards the Piazza Sordello, taking him up to the culminating point of Mantua, to the palace. The click of Pietro's shoes on cobblestones was thanks to an important noble visitor to Mantua many years earlier, whom the Duke at the time had tried his best to impress with his fine palace and incredible artworks and culture, only to have the visitor complain of the mud in the streets and the square leading to the palace. In a fit of pique, the Duke had had the entire city paved, and so the thousands of stones leading from Pietro's house to the palace kept his clothing relatively unscathed by the elements. The city already had a reputation for being a hotbed of disease. Well, at least you could catch malaria or pneumonia without having your shoes or clothing caked in mud. Arriving at the Piazza Sordello, Pietro walked through the gate of St. Peter and kept on walking over the smooth river stones that paved the square. He could see the ducal palace on the right. In front of him stood the ancient cathedral of St. Peter, where even now, early in the morning, pilgrims were converging to get a glimpse of the holy relic housed in the church. The relic of the Holy Blood of Christ. Legend had it that it was taken to Mantua by Longino, the Roman soldier who struck Jesus in the chest. He collected the earth under the cross, mixed with the blood of Christ, and came to Mantua to preach the gospel. The cathedral is a mixture of Romanesque, Gothic and Baroque styles, and within is the final resting place of the Dukes of Mantua, and perhaps one day Pietro's boss. But he was not to know that his unstable patron would be the last of the Gonzaga dukes. Well, not yet anyway. Next to the Palazzo Acerbi, facing into the square, stood the Torre della Gabbia, the Tower of the Cage. Pietro shuddered as he glanced up at the cage perched high on the outer side of the medieval tower. Unfortunate criminals could and would find themselves imprisoned for all to see, literally hanging over the people's heads as a reminder of who ruled the city. The Piazza Sordello is not the bustling square that Pietro had just walked through, the Piazza delle Erbe, which was bursting with life and market stalls held by the citizens of the city. No, here in this piazza is the religious and political heart of the city, where you went to find the dukes and cardinals, pray for your eternal soul, or plan a warring campaign against your neighbours. Looking into the piazza were the facades of palaces of the ruling families of Mantua, but the most important and the epicenter of activity where any powerful person wanted to be was the ducal palace, and that was where Pietro was headed, carrying yet another instrument for the ducal collection under his arms. The present Duke and Duchess of Mantua were from the French line of Gonzagas. Well, he was anyway. And as such, Pietro made this set of instruments with beautifully inlaid fleurs-de-lis in the corners of the violins. By ordering these instruments decorated with the fleurs-de-lis, the Duke and Duchess of Mantua were clearly stating their alliance with the French for anyone who cared to look. Visiting nobles to the court of Mantua would see this symbol on the instruments played by the court musicians and understand where their allegiance lied, or who was funding the Mantuan court in any case. And as I mentioned, things were heating up in Europe between the Austrians, the French and the Spanish. Little old Mantua was placed in a very strategic position, and nothing says I'm French more than one of those little fleurs-de-lis. Now, have I mentioned that Ferdinando Carlo was a bit of a loser? Well, in all fairness, he hadn't been dealt the best hand in life, starting with the handicap in the form of his father, who, to begin with, was not the sharpest tool in the shed. Born himself from a syphilitic-ridden father, not the best start in life. Fortunately, the women of the family managed to make wise choices, saving the dukedom many times over. It is said of Ferdinando's father that, and I quote, his only recorded achievements were the enrichment of jewelers, pornographers, and Margherita della Rovere's relations. That was his favourite courtesan mistress, who he kept in a palace to help maintain his playboy lifestyle. Meanwhile, his wife, the Duchess, was running the shop with one of her chief advisors/lover, the Count Bulgarini, and so the little Ferdinando Carlo, who in the eyes of his mother could do no wrong, with the doting mother, no reliable role models, an open checkbook and spades of entitlement, there's no wonder he turned into a bit of a twat. He became Duke when he was still a minor, his father dying quite young at the age of 36, supposedly of malaria, but maybe syphilis like his father. It was said that his debauched and dissolute lifestyle was his ultimate undoing. But by the time the Guarneris had arrived in Mantua, Ferdinando had been in charge for the past 10 years, doing his best to run the dukedom into the ground. He was always in need of more finances for his long curly wigs, jewelled medallions and Mars-like armour he chose to strut around in, and for his favourite courtiers, courtesans, and his ceaseless debaucheries. And let's not forget court musicians, and why not have some lovely violins made as well? So what if he kept selling off bits of the dukedom? He needed lots of money, and he needed it now. So deals and treaties were made with the French to support his lifestyle. The French were his allies, his family, and the proof, in one very small way, was inlaid in the court instruments made by Pietro Guarneri and the fleurs-de-lis that adorn these violins. Time and time again, in political negotiations, Ferdinando would back the French, and almost every time his decisions would backfire. The man could not take a hint. He was so inept at managing affairs that even the French would ultimately give up on him, leaving him to his own devices. Pietro's court appointment was good news for Caterina and Pietro's ever-growing family. Their third daughter, Anna Maria Caterina, had only lived for 5 months, but since then she had had another 3 children. You'll be happy to know these 3 would live until adulthood, and at the time of Pietro's employment at the court, she was pregnant for the 7th time. If you're wondering, yes, that is 7 pregnancies in 8 years. Family planning appears to have been a mystery to the highly fertile Pietro and his wife. In 1685, with his financial position more stable, Pietro was able to help out his father in paying what remained of his little sister Elisabetta's dowry. Things appeared to be tight for the Cremonese Guarneris, and it was his family duty to chip in. News from home is that Antonio Stradivari's business is becoming the prime workshop in town. Pietro's little brother Giuseppe is taking on more and more responsibilities in the workshop, and Andrea is beginning to feel his age. Pietro was walking down seemingly endless hallways once again. As he made his way through the ducal palace for a performance for the Duke Ferdinando Carlo, the extent of luxury in which the dukes lived was unimaginable to Pietro. Just one of these impressive oil paintings hanging on the walls of the palace in worth alone could feed his family for a lifetime, and there were literally hundreds of these artworks littering the palace, not to mention the frescoes. The clicking of his shoes on the marble floors echoed off high-domed frescoed ceilings as Pietro and other musicians weaved their way through corridors and galleries that joined over 500 rooms in the palace. At first he would get hopelessly lost in the labyrinth of luxury the Duke and Duchess of Mantua called home, but now he knew to stick to the other musicians and not get distracted by the bling. They quickly crossed another courtyard with finely manicured gardens and a gushing central fountain. Through colonnades and archways on they went. Nothing could have prepared Pietro Guarneri for the explosion of colour, texture and opulence he first faced when entering the services of the Duke of Mantua. As a musician, this was the most amazing place he had ever seen. Its fame throughout Europe as a court to rival that of the most cultured was not for nothing. The ducal palace was in fact not one, but a group of buildings, a suburb almost, comprising countless rooms, hallways, staircases, sitting rooms, bedrooms, receiving rooms, servant quarters, gardens, courtyards, and of course, rooms dedicated to entertainment and music. The courtyards, gardens, galleries, and arcades joined up over 30,000 square metres of palace, and there were 500 rooms, 22 courtyards, 7 towers, 4 gardens, 122 cottages or outhouses, 4 stables, 45 undergrounds. You didn't want to end up down there. A church and a theatre. No wonder Pietro was lost. But if you stopped and took a closer look, you would start to realise that these days cash was not so flush, and there was a discreet yet present decline in the standards the dukes were so well known for. The duke was perhaps not so powerful as his forefathers used to be, and they may not be in their golden period anymore. If things were starting to fall into disrepair and skimping had to be made, it was definitely not going to be the entertainment's budget. No way. Appearances were everything, and the duke had to look after that gorgeous hair of his. In these years, Pietro was busy making violins and playing for his court appointment in Mantua. But a year after his little brother's wedding, Mantua was invaded. Of course, Pietro's wife was well into pregnancy number 11, and the atmosphere at court was so tense you could cut through it with a knife. As a court musician, Pietro was privy to all the details of what was going on, and it was unsurprisingly the Duke's mishandling of the situation that had put the entire population of the city in peril. The year is 1691. Well, if there was one thing the Duke of Mantua disliked more than being faithful to his wife, it was actual bodily harm, or the potential threat of harm. He did have that extravagant hair, remember? And now that threat was real. Remember that cousin of his wife's, Vincenzo, the one married to his sister-in-law and the so-called Duke of Guastalla? Well, he had gotten particularly cozy with the Spanish, always ready to undermine him, and now they were invading. This called for a quick retreat to Venice. Anna Isabella, the Duchess, could stay behind. It was her family mess that had got them here in the first place anyway. She was better at these things than him. Could the fact that Ferdinand had concluded a pact with Louis XIV of France, selling him that strategic little town of Casale, have anything to do with it? Ferdinand had got himself a nice little pension of 60,000 lire a year, a career as an army general, not that he planned to do any actual fighting, and a part in any future French conquests in Italy. I mean, could that have annoyed the Spanish? That whole Casale thing was a bit of a schmozzle when the king's minister, Count Ercole Mattioli, let the enemy know about the sale of the town. He was arrested by the French for leaking the information and maybe or maybe not becoming the infamous man in the iron mask. Then maybe there was that little thing with Guastalla where he had improved the fortifications of the city in the secret intent of selling the place to the French. That was just bad luck. The Spanish governor in Milan had visited and maybe guessed what he was up to and had that meddling Vincenzo come and take it all down. Okay, so perhaps the people of Mantua thought he was a bit of a douchebag for that, but the Spanish invading, he really had to get out of there, and slip out he did. Anna was going to be furious. Well, you've got to give it to her. Anna Isabella grabbed the Spanish bull by the horns, so to say, and in her husband's absence became regent. Ferdinand preferred the term regrouping to fleeing. Bands of Spanish soldiers were now swaggering through the city and terrifying its citizens. Pietro Guarneri did not need this stress at the moment. She was pregnant again. When was she not? And life was hectic enough as it was without this mess. The Duchess managed to calm the people of Mantua, organise their defence and negotiate peace treaties with Spain and the Spanish governor in Milan, Antonio Lopez, and the Viceroy of Naples. This all concluded in 1692, 1 year later. Ferdinand, of course, came slinking back after this was all put in place. They had lost Guastalla. Vincenzo was now named Duke, but Ferdinand knew his time would come. He would just have to wait. Pietro was still working on instruments for the court of Mantua, decorating them with different variations of fleur-de-lis. The Duke was still desperately hanging on to the French connection in the hope that they might come to his rescue one day if he needed them. At this point, Pietro was living comfortably with his family. His court appointment meant that he could not only carry his tools, but also a weapon, a sword. And he also had a passport. This meant that he could come and go from Mantua for business or visit family without losing his job and property. And now that the city was no longer under attack, things were looking good. But not for long, because the next year, shortly after the birth of their 13th child, Giacomo Antonio, whose very short life would only last 2 months, Caterina herself passed away. In the last 15 years, she had given birth to 13 children. That is almost 1 child every year, and I'm going to guess that her death may have been related to a complication after this last birth. Pietro was obviously devastated, but with 5 small children, the oldest being only 10 years old, he simply did not have time to mourn his wife. He was in a city in which neither he or his wife had any family support. Pietro, as I have mentioned, was employed by the court of Mantua, and in particular the Duchess, Anna Isabella. Now, the Duchess was originally from the town of Guastalla, the one that the Mantuan dukes had lost, and in her entourage she had, of course, ladies of waiting. Some of these girls were also from her hometown of Guastalla, and one in particular had caught the eye of Pietro, the young Lucia Burani. Perhaps it was his charm and his talent as a musician that appealed. Pietro's prospects were relatively good, but whatever. This was enough for this young 26-year-old Lucia, who held a respectable dowry, to accept the 39-year-old Pietro's offer of marriage, along with his children aged 10, 9, 8, 6, 5, and 3. Maybe the man was bursting with charisma. Maybe Lucia desperately wanted to leave the court of the Duke and its intrigues. Life was a dangerous place for a single lady at court. Caterina died in September 1693, a very short time after the birth of her 13th child, and in November, Pietro and Lucia were married. As she was in the employ of the Duchess, they had to ask her permission, and of course there was the funeral of Caterina. The Duchess must have approved of the match of one of her ladies to the court musician and instrument maker, left in a dire situation, and this gives us the impression that he was well appreciated in the court of Mantua. The wedding took place in a chapel in the cathedral, with one of the Lord Chamberlains as a witness. Lucia was now Pietro's wife, living in Mantua in her new home with 6 small children to look after. That sounds a bit brutal, but she must have been on board with the arrangement when she agreed to marry him. Hopefully he did tell her about the kids before they tied the knot. Imagine if he had kept that a surprise. In any case, 1 month after her wedding, Lucia herself had fallen pregnant to the ever-fertile Pietro. And with one more Guarneri on the way, Pietro was looking for a house to buy. This was now possible with his wife's new dowry. And so in May, when Lucia was 5 months pregnant, the Guarneri family moved into their new home. It was wonderful, bigger than any home Pietro had lived in previously. Definitely more impressive than the family home back in Cremona. This house in the centre of Mantua he was buying from the Bianchi family. And to seal the deal, he basically bought the family debt and agreed to pay off a variety of items the family owed. And this included dowries for several family members and an annual payment to the monastery next door, various other accounts the family had yet to settle, and money owed to peoples. It was all a bit complicated. But you never knew, with the mortality rates being what they were in those times, perhaps half of them would die before getting married. As I said, Pietro was a betting man. In any case, this house, compared to the home he grew up in Cremona, was large and spacious, and worth a few dowries to girls he didn't know. Pietro was doing well for himself. His new wife was from a prominent family and well known in Mantua. He himself was a respected musician and instrument maker. He had become a citizen of Mantua and now was a landowner. Their new house and shop was situated on the Via Montenegro, otherwise called the Via della Cicogna, in town, and things were looking good for Pietro Guarneri in 1694. In 1695, back in Cremona, Pietro's parents were aging. Their house was still a lively place, as his younger brother was living with them with his wife and children. The workshop was attracting business, and even though Stradivari, a few doors down, was taking all the best commissions, since the death of Eusebio, Pietro's brother, his boys were also living with them. But he now received word from his youngest brother Giuseppe, Filius Andrea, that their mother, Anna Maria, had died, and her funeral would have already taken place. Pietro continued playing music at the unstable yet continuously flamboyant Gonzaga court, and still making instruments, violins mainly. He was making another violin for the Mantuan dukes like he had been doing for the last few years with the fleur-de-lis pattern in the corners. There was plenty of work as the court was full of music and someone needed to supply the instruments and strings and fix any major problems that could and would arise. The varnish on Pietro's instruments was a beautiful transparent red, or sometimes golden. He would have the local apothecary mix it up. He was a talented chemist, and Pietro would ask for the best quality. He was, by the way, making instruments for important people who would expect the best. Philip Cass.
He could afford to get the best ingredients that probably weren't necessarily readily available to later generations. You get a lot of reds, really beautiful, transparent reds in Pietro Guarneri's varnishes, and oranges. And they were probably locally sourced ingredients and probably locally made by an apothecary around the corner. It was the best quality ingredients and probably a classical formulation. It's curious that they would do that in a town with such strange weather conditions, but apparently it was not affected that much by it.
In December 1698, Pietro was 43 years old and he had finally finished paying off all the dowries he was obliged to pay in the agreement for purchasing their home. And Lucia had their fourth child. It was time to return to Cremona. His father, Antonio's health was failing and it would be good to get things sorted out before he passed away. He had not seen his brother in a long time and a visit was long overdue. There was also the fact that his father was doing his best to cut him out of his will to the best of his ability. Andrea was definitely able to hold a grudge, that was for sure, and he was determined to give Pietro the strict minimum, if even that at all. With this on his mind, Pietro set out for his hometown of Cremona. It had been made clear for years now to Pietro that his father had not forgiven him for leaving the family home and moving to Mantua. Yet he had not let this get in the way of his relationship with his younger brother Giuseppe, and on returning to Cremona, although he was saddened to see his father so frail, he was equally delighted to learn that he had another nephew. There was already the young Andrea, who was 7 years old. Of course, his little namesake, Pietro, about to turn 4, and now there was Bartolomeo Giuseppe, who would become known as Del Gesù. And his brother and sister-in-law had asked him to be godfather, something he would gladly do. Now, Andrea's will had made provision for a variety of people, but in essence his two heirs were Pietro and Giuseppe, and they would inherit his property in equal portions. But, and this was a big but, Giuseppe was to inherit the workshop, and this meant the house that went with it. Now the problem was that Andrea's most valuable asset was the two houses on the Piazza San Domenico, and Giuseppe absolutely wanted to keep these to stay in the central instrument-making district. The agreement the brothers came to was this. Pietro let Giuseppe keep everything, and he would be paid 600 Cremonese lire. Although this looks like an incredibly good deal for Giuseppe, it was in fact fraught with complications. Keeping his father's estate would end up to be a quagmire indeed. But for now, Pietro could walk away with some cash in his pocket and no responsibilities to relatives and return to his family in Mantua. Just a few months after the two brothers had signed on this agreement, Andrea died, leaving the Guarneri name and workshop to his son, Giuseppe Filius Andrea. After Pietro's last visit to his father, he arrived home to his family in Mantua and was back at work, finishing another violin for the Mantuan court. He has an excellent choice of wood, finished off with a golden brown varnish. In the wealthy and cultured court of Mantua, he was creating real works of beauty. But right now, these works of beauty would have to be put on hold. because there was the problem of his little brother not paying him his share of their father's inheritance that they had agreed on just before Andrea's death. He would have to go to Cremona to pick up the money, or Giuseppe would just keep pretending he didn't exist. He loved his brother, but when it came to money, this story was only ever settled 8 years later, in 1708, when the brothers met in Mantua for a final settlement. When he returned home, Lucia had given birth to another little girl, Eleonora. She was such a small baby, who knew how long she would live for? Pietro returned to his workshop and continued on with the 2 violins he had been working on, placing the pins in the back of the instruments to centre the plates. For these violins, he had found beautiful one-piece back. His work was as polished and elegant as always, varnishing them in the free time he had when he was not playing the viol or violin for the Duke and Duchess and their entourage. Once again, there was a sense of unease at court these days, with whispers of the Duke and his legendary dubious decisions leading the duchy into trouble. 4 months later, Pietro's little Eleonora died, amid the stifling damp heat of the Mantuan summer. Then, as the weather began to cool in the autumn months of November, it all started to happen. In November of this same year, 1700, 1,500 kilometres away, the King of Spain died. Charles II had no heir, and this created a bit of a feeding frenzy, as the Spanish Empire at this stage was incredibly vast and powerful. Everyone wanted a piece of the pie, and the death of this king would directly affect Pietro in Mantua, very soon in fact. The war that followed this king's death is called the War of the Spanish Succession, and what that meant for the people of Mantua was another invasion. Cremona was not coming out of this war unscathed either. It was going to be bad for both branches of the Guarneri family. Mantua was squeezed between the French and the Imperial Austrian forces. If only Ferdinand just listened to the advice of the Pope and Venice to take a neutral stance. But no, he doesn't. He latches himself onto France. Was he backing the right horse? No, he was not. He chose the wrong side again. Both Mantua and Milan were strategically placed as a gateway to Austria. Austria doesn't want these cities to fall into French hands, but that is just what happened. Mantua was an easy pick for the French, as the Duke was always sliding their way, and he may have accidentally opened the gates under duress, in air quotes, of course, and let the French troops in April of 1701. For this, Louis, King of France, gave Ferdinand 60,000 scudi straight up and 36,000 every month after. The Duke had now literally sold the city. And so one asks themselves, what would Ferdinand do? It had to be said that now was as good a time as any to leave Mantua. Strategic retreat, he liked to call it, in the capable hands of his wife again. I mean, she did a pretty good job the last time he skipped town, but really, you have to give it to the man. He does stay in character. Now, when the new Spanish king was named that year, Philip V, Ferdinand was the only prince, the only one to openly support the Bourbons. They're the French. They were the enemy to all the cities surrounding them. Read the room, Ferdinand. He was declared a traitor by the Holy Roman Emperor, and now they were being besieged by the Austrians. I know it's not the Spanish, but it was complicated. Suffice it to say that it wasn't nice, and for the tidy sum of 2,000 pistole, the French now controlled Mantua. Ferdinand's move was to take another holiday to leave the Duchess sort it all out again. So in 1701, Mantua was occupied by the French, but it wasn't long before the Holy Roman Emperor sent his best man, the Prince Eugene of Savoy. A sort of military genius, and as the King of France put it, I have warned you that you are dealing with an enterprising young prince, wrote Louis XIV to his commander. He does not tie himself down to the rules of war. Does that mean he plays dirty? Probably. For the Guarneris, Pietro was continuing to make violins, and Lucia was pregnant again. The city was full of French soldiers. The Austrians had their sights on Mantua, and rumour had it that they were preparing for a blockade. This was a very stressful time for a mother. Lucia had a house full of children. There were soldiers everywhere, and who knew what was going to happen? When she finally gave birth to the little Anna Maria in October, the baby only lived 1 day. The family would not have much time to grieve the death of this little one because now Mantua was well and truly under a blockade. Nothing was coming in or going out of the city. The busy canal that flowed into the heart of Mantua was now eerily quiet, and who knew how long they would be cut off from the world. Well, this situation lasted for about 6 months, the time it took to convince the Duke to change sides, and it worked. In July, the Duke of Mantua accompanied Vendôme to Cremona to pay homage to King Philip V of Spain. The Duke of Mantua proposed his services to the King of Spain as volunteer in the army of the Pope. Mantua was a mess. The Duke was collecting cash where he could, but for now it was time to leave his crippled dukedom, besieged and battered, in the capable hands of his wife and see what she could sort out with what was left. He would just shuffle off to Casale. Remember that town he sold to the French a few years ago? It was now more or less abandoned by the French and turned out to be a nice retreat from any type of responsibility. For now, Mantua was no longer under blockade. This meant that goods from outside Mantua could finally arrive into the city on the canals and life was going to get back to normal. But for how long, no one really knew. The Duke had left, leaving the Duchess to pick up the pieces, and all through these years since 1700, Pietro kept making instruments, violins of an exquisite craftsmanship, and then in 1703, Anna Isabella, the Duchess of Mantua, fell ill. She was very unwell. Of course she had been poorly before, but this time it did not look good at all. A messenger was sent to her husband, the Duke, in Casale, where he had been for months, now probably hoping things would just work themselves out in Mantua. But this news was troubling indeed. How was he going to manage the city without that trusty wife of his? No, don't worry, he wasn't actually going to go to Mantua. No. What Ferdinand did was send suggestions for a body of regents who might rule after her death for him. There was most probably a lot of eye-rolling amongst the musicians at this news, but one position that stood firm throughout all these transitions were the people who played a pretty tune. You always needed a soundtrack to your life, and if Pietro Guarneri did not have so many gigs nowadays, he definitely had a funeral coming up, and the new regents of the city could not go without some background music and entertainments. That was for sure. Lucia was pregnant again, a state in which she spent most of her time, not unlike Pietro's first wife. This would be their 8th child in 9 years. Woo! At home, some of the older children from Pietro's first wife, Caterina, have left home. Their eldest daughter, Teresa Francesca, had taken holy orders. Antonio is 19, Paola is 18, and would leave the family home in the next year. Angela is 16 and will also leave when she is 19 in 3 years' time. And then there is Francesco, who at this time is 14, but he will also take holy orders when he is older, leaving his younger half-siblings and following in the footsteps of many of his brothers and sisters. Of Lucia's surviving children, there is Alessandro, 11, Caterina, 7, Isabella, 5, and Giuseppe, the little 1-year-old. These were uncertain times for the Mantuan Guarneris. With the death of the Duchess and the unpredictable Duke, nothing was set in stone. Said Duke was now turning his attention to finding a new wife, maybe one with an interesting dowry. He was always in need of cash, and seeing as he had sold off most of the family assets, things were getting uncomfortable for a bon vivant such as himself. Ferdinando Carlo Gonzaga, Duke of Mantua, was now 52 years old and a little bit worse for wear, what with his debauched lifestyle and all. But in the year 1704, a year after Anna Isabella died, he remarried, and this time to the lovely Suzanne Henriette of Lorraine. Her father was Charles of Lorraine, and a duke also. When the 18-year-old Susanna arrived in Mantua to meet her much older and most likely diseased by this point husband, she must have truly been asking herself what she had done to deserve this. But the music played on, so to speak, and one of those musicians, Pietro Guarneri, was most likely there wondering how things were going to pan out for this young lady. The Duke had returned to Mantua to prepare a glorious welcome for his new bride, in the quiet assurance that this link with France was going to work out and protect him. The ever-hopeful Duke received his bride in the spring of 1706, almost like a mail order, really. In the same year, 1706, Lucia Guarneri would have her last child, Vittoria, who would only live a few months, and that would make 10 children, and for Pietro, 23 in all. None, mind you, would go on to become a violin maker. And in this same year, the Duke and Duchess of Mantua had their portraits painted by the very sought-after and I imagine very expensive artist, Hyacinthe Rigaud. Only 5 years ago, this same artist had painted King Louis XIV in his coronation robes, and many of the most noble people, not only in France but in Europe. And now he was here to paint Ferdinand and Suzanne. The Duke is painted in his preferred dress for portraits, his armour, to show how valiant he is. So he may not have technically fought in any wars, but he had been there, at a distance perhaps, but he had lived war, okay? And he was ready to defend his interests no matter what. Standing proudly, one hand holding a staff, his long curly wig flowing over his shoulders, as he looks off into the distance with, quite frankly, ominous-looking clouds in the background. A storm was definitely brewing. It's quite powerful and somewhat prophetic. Suzanne Henriette, the last Duchess of Mantua, is sitting on a gilded chair surrounded by swathes of rich fabrics and ermine fur. Her dress is a shimmering gold with a rose tucked into the front. She too is looking out, not to the viewer but off to the distance, probably wondering when her husband will run off or die. Either will do. And obligingly, Ferdinando will soon do both. Once again, Ferdinand had chosen the wrong side to back. Will this man ever learn? And that irritatingly good warrior prince, Eugene of Savoy, kicked the French out of Italy in the Battle of Turin. Milan, Mantua, and all their territories were now ruled by Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor. The advice given to Ferdinand Carlo was to flee with his wife to Rome to the protection of the Pope, who might persuade the emperor to restore his dukedom. But no, he was making his own decisions, and so true to form, he abandoned his new French wife, took off to Padua, that was part of the Venetian state, and basically emptied the cupboards as he went, Ferdinando style. He took with him 50 horses, over 900 works of art, and anything else of value he could lay his pale, pasty, finely manicured hands on. As he rode off, I wonder if he even said goodbye to his wife, and how that would have gone. In any case, he left the 20-year-old Suzanne to negotiate with the Austrians, probably thanking her lucky stars the marriage was such a brief one. Okay, technically they were still married, but she would be damned if she was going to go after that piece of work. She was leaving this swamp and going home. She would depart for Paris and the court of Louis XIV, who would support her until her all-too-early death at the age of 24. By disease, perhaps, a virus, an infection, poison, you take your pick. Before Ferdinand's death in Padua in 1708, he was once again declared a traitor and was stripped officially of all rights to the dukedom of Mantua. But where does this leave our violinist and violin maker, you ask yourself? Well, Pietro stayed in Mantua. He had the family, the house, the connections, and when the Austrians took over the city, they appointed rulers. They were no longer dukes, and there were far less paintings and artworks in the palace these days, 900 less to be precise. But these rulers sent to Mantua were men of culture and often music-loving individuals, and so life would in fact continue for the Guarneris. And you've got to hand it to the man. He just kept on making instruments over these years, and they are beautiful. During the difficult and uncertain times of transition of power, the family would have had to draw on their savings and resources. But as soon as things were rolling again, he would have been back in the palace looking for work, offering his services and selling and repairing instruments for his fellow musicians. The city of Mantua had definitely slid down the ladder in status from an art-loving, extravagant dukedom to simply an outpost of the Austrian Empire. But the art ran deep, and the ex-courtiers would find a way to stay on. Fortunately for them, the incoming nobles sent out to run Mantua decided to keep the majority of the courtly appointments. So this meant that Pietro still had a job, but things were not completely smooth sailing. As time went on, the people of Mantua settled into the new administration under the Austrians. Things did not improve in Mantua, with the land ravaged by passing armies and then flooding. Add to that a huge economic downturn from all these factors. Things were looking bleak for the average Mantuan, and on top of that, the Austrians were very good at getting their taxes, something that the Spanish had not particularly excelled at, let's say. Pietro and his neighbours in Mantua made a formal appeal in 1709 to the emperor to be relieved of taxes. The war, the floods, and military occupation had reduced the majority of citizens to the extremes of misery, and I quote, "They had lived through the end of the Dukes of Mantua into the rule of the Austrian Empire, and it was a bumpy ride." Lucia is now in her early 40s, and menopause appears to have kicked in, thank goodness. And Pietro is 55, still going strong. Sadly, in the middle of a hot summer in 1711, the Guarneri's youngest son, Giuseppe Antonio, dies at the age of 10. He had survived infancy, miracle, and could have grown up to become a violin maker like his father. We'll never know, but this sad event definitely put an end to any future generations of violin makers from the Mantuan branch of Guarneri's. The year is now 1715, and all of Pietro's children are grown by now, many of them entering into religious orders. To give you some context, this is around the time of Stradivari's golden period over in Cremona. One of Pietro's daughters enters a convent, the convent of the Annunziata in San Giorgio, across the lake, where she would have met one of Antonio Stradivari's daughters, who had entered the same religious order. And now at the age of 60, he slows down, and over the next few years will make his final instruments. He is comfortably well off with his wife in their house, and in the year 1720, a day before he dies, on the 25th of March, he draws up a will. He could feel it coming. He leaves 12 lire to the Hospital of Mantua, oil paintings to the convents of his girls, books to his sons, who are Franciscan friars, and to his wife and unmarried daughters, his property. There was also the contents of his workshop. Left in the workshop were tables, benches, armoires, chests, tool racks, and so on. There were 2 cellos with their bows, guitars, theorbos, lutes, violas of diverse types, bows made of snakewood, some partly finished, a body of a harp, planes, tools, knives, files, saws, scrapers, 15 violins finished with their varnish, 1 smaller violin without varnish, and 8 violins by various makers. We see that he makes bows and most likely accessories. There were several items of jewellery, a ring with a small diamond. He looks to have been quite wealthy. In 1720, on the 27th of March, Pietro Guarneri dies. He was 66 and buried in the church of San Francesco di Paola. We don't know of any pupils, and his sons did not continue on in the craft. Philip Cass.
None of the violin makers who worked in Mantua was a native of Mantua. They all came from somewhere else. None of them set up a business that they passed on to their children. None of them had a child in the trade as a successor.
Was that because it wasn't very particularly... I mean, there were better things to do in Mantua?
I think there were better and more lucrative things to do, and there might be a market for a while. But again, there's how many violins does a town of, it was maybe 15,000 people back then. I mean, at its peak, Mantua had maybe 50,000 people. That was before the big plague. When that was over, it was like 15,000 were left. It was a massive die off. And it's taken until the present for it to actually grow big enough. It's just been a backwater all these years. And so if in a town of 15,000, how many violins do people need? I'm sure these people were doing an awful lot of repair work just to pay the bills. But then that makes it, I can't imagine that if they had children, I'm sure that the kids probably looked at this and thought, this is not a business I'm going into.
And this brings us to an end of the life of Pietro of Mantua, an elegant and refined, and I feel somewhat overlooked at times, but who lived in fascinating times and managed to navigate court intrigue and the overthrow of his adopted city in style, and ended his life with something to pass on to his children. Well, the few who did survive. Thank you for listening to this episode of Pietro Guarneri of Mantua. I would like to say a very special thank you to my guest, Philip Cass. And if you would like to hear some of the lovely music created by Pietro's violins, maybe pop down to the opera one day and perhaps you will get a glimpse of a violin dressed up with the royal fleur-de-lis.